get to the final chapter, which is where they talk about what the celebration actually was written at the time, which we're going to look at in a minute. And then we're going to look at this whole tradition around Judith, Yehudit, who has become connected and related to Hanukkah. And we're going to look, not going to look so much at the story first. We're going to look at sort of like a very interesting article that explains all the traditions and all the connections and who Judith was. And actually a new food has been introduced in some places, and we might think about it next year as connected to Judith and Hanukkah. I'll give you a hint what the food is. I'll tell you what the food is because it's so crazy. It's cheese. There's a reason to eat cheese on Hanukkah now, besides on Shavuot, where we have cheese blintzes. They don't say what the cheese is, but anyway, we'll look at that in a few minutes. And the tradition of her and the power of this Yehudit for, the last 2,000 years, and she came and went. So it's very, very interesting. But first, let's say a bracha for studying together. So please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher ishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, to be in the words or study of Torah. Okay, so first we're just going to complete the Maccabee thing because it's probably the most interesting part that we didn't get to last time, which is the very last chapter of the book. That there are two books. So wait, did you share? Yeah. Okay. And it's just, there are two books of Maccabees. And by the way, it's not in, as I said, in the Tanakh. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. And we can talk about that for a minute after. Why it's in the Christian Bible, but it is not in the Hebrew Bible. And there are a number of reasons. But first, let's just read. This is all it says about the celebration. And then in the Talmud, like 600 years later, this was added on the right in the italics. But first, let's just read. Now, this was translated from the Greek, so they call him Maccabeus, but we're talking about Judah Maccabee, Yehuda HaMaccabee. And again, it's written from the point of view of the Maccabees themselves. So who would like to read? Cindy, you want to read?
When Maccabeus and his companions, under the Lord's leadership, had recovered the temple and the city, they destroyed the altars erected by the foreigners. I guess that's the Syrians?
Yes.
In the marketplace and the sacred shrines.
So these were, if you recall, they had erected in the temple and all over the city and other cities, altars sacrificing to Zeus, to the Greek gods. And in the actual temple, they had put a huge altar on top of they stole our altar. They put it on top, and they were sacrificing pigs on the altar with statues of Zeus or other gods. Okay, continue.
After purifying the temple, they made another altar. Then, with fires struck from flint, they offered sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, burned incense in lighted lamps. They also set out the showbread. Can I ask you what you say the altar, is that idols too?
Where? Which
they say that they made it, that the foreigners had.
Yeah, they had, all of the ancient world sacrificed on altars to the gods. It's like basically sort of a barbecue, a glorified barbecue pit sort of thing. But our altar was beautiful and gold, and it was shaped in a certain way. I don't know if they actually had that remade or they built a quick one because they wanted to sacrifice. Because why was sacrificing in the temple so important, do you think?
Because it was in the Torah.
But what did it mean to the people? This is like,
Well, it fed some of the tribes, the priestly tribes.
But but what's the point of sacrifice? I want to try to get more.
May I guess, Rabbi?
Yeah.
To show dedication to God's holiness and
yes, close to that. And one of the sacrifices was a thank you, a gratitude, saying
Yes.
thank you and giving God, gifts and a kind of a like, thank you for, our victory. And so we have to give gratitude. We have to give thanks. So that's probably, it was one of those kind of sacrifices. And here's another thing. They lighted lamps. What lamps do you think those were?
The menorah, the Hanukkah.
Well, there wasn't a Chanukia then.
Well,
The menorah.
Menorah.
So, we're talking about the story of the, that they didn't have oil, but here they're saying they lit them. They lit the menorahs. So, I mean, in the time, there was no miracle. It happened later. Okay, so they lit the menorahs and they burned incense and they put out the showbread. The showbread were like 12 loaves of bread that were supposed to be baked every day that they put out. And the challah is kind of derived from that. Once the temple was destroyed, the rabbis basically moved the whole idea of the temple rituals into the home of every Jew. You lit candles like they had the menorah. Instead of the showbread, you had challah. They had libations, which is the kiddush. And your table was the altar where you ate. So, because people participated eating, so they turned the Shabbat table into everybody's personal temple. One
So they never
was destroyed. What, Leslie?
They never did any of that kind of thing before this. Everything was you had your Shabbat dinner at the table in your home, and everything else was done in a synagogue.
I mean, a Shabbat dinner wasn't you. It was just a dinner. It wasn't the same. No, I'm talking about before the temple, not the synagogue. When the temple in Jerusalem existed,
everything was done there. You're saying.
Yes.
But what if you lived far away? Then how would you do things? We were just.
Just want you to know.
You didn't have to do it. It just happened there. The priest did it. It wasn't something that people did in their homes. They maybe ate Shabbat dinner, but there was no kiddush, there was no challah, there was no candle lighting, there was none of that. That happened. You just rested. You rested. You ate and you rested. There were none of these rituals. But then after, unless maybe after we believe that the temple was destroyed, and there was no way to light a menorah or have the showbread or have the libations, the rabbis brilliantly, and Jews were scattered. They didn't even live in Judea and Israel. They had been taken to Rome and here and there. They created this beautiful Shabbat that you could do at home. So instead of this happening in the temple, everybody was a priest now, so to speak, symbolically. We were all priests and doing the rituals. Yes, Donna, your question?
What is this? Well, the showbread. What was that shaped like? Was that like 12, like the 12 tribes? Twine?
I guess. I don't know. They don't really, I haven't found any description of it, but I don't think it was the twisted challah. I'm not sure.
I would like to do that on a show, the showbread.
Yeah, the showbread was just for show.
In a sacred way. And respectful.
Yes. It's an interesting question. Okay. So Cindy, just one more, verse 4.
When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, and that if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous Gentiles.
So it's like, please God, if we sin, if you want to punish us, just do it in moderation. Don't go to such extremes that it's so terrible. Sadly, the Romans came, not that long after, like 100 years later, and the Romans were they didn't force their religion on them, but they were just as oppressive. But so they said, okay, God, we're whatever we did, we're sorry, we're here. We're also, don't forget, if you recall, before this, a lot of the Jews had become very Hellenized and very Greek. So maybe they were saying that it's because of that this all happened. Who knows? People always want to ascribe a reason. Okay. Number 5. So here's the Hanukkah celebration itself. So who would like to read? Okay, Doris. number 5. But you're muted, Doris.
Apologize.
Okay.
On the anniversary of the day on which the temple had been profaned by the foreigners, that is the 25th of the same month, Kislev,
Okay, and that is the date of Hanukkah to this day, 25th of Kislev. Go ahead.
the purification of the temple took place. The Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days, as on the Feast of Booths.
Okay,
Remember-
what's Booths? What's the Feast of Booths?
Sukkah.
Sukkot.
Sukkot.
Sukkot. Now, they didn't celebrate Sukkot, but they took the idea that like on Sukkot, we celebrate for 8 days. We certainly should celebrate for 8 days and continue.
remembering how a little while before they had spent the Feast of Booths living like wild animals in the mountains and in caves.
So they barely had a Sukkot, and now they were like recreating a holiday similar to Sukkot. And what did they do? Verse 7, keep going.
Carrying rods entwined with leaves, beautiful branches and palms, they sang hymns of grateful praise to him who had successfully brought about the purification of his own place.
So they were thanking God. But that sounds like lulavs, doesn't it? It sounds like
they were
lulavs.
decorating the
Temple.
tent.
But they were carrying rods and branches and palms. It's similar to, there's no etrog and whatever, but there is that hallel where that you march around in circles. Okay, Doris, end it.
By
Close it
public
up.
decree and vote, they prescribed that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Such was the end of Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes.
Epiphanies. By the way, I don't know why I never crossed my mind, but Antiochus is from the city Antioch in Syria. I guess I just went, oh my God, duh, Okay, so now they said this is a national holiday that we should celebrate every year for 8 days. Any mention of oil or miracle?
Not yet.
In the story at
Not
all.
yet.
That came
Okay,
later.
But okay,
Rabbi,
yes.
if you look up showbread in Rabbi Google here,
Oh, yes.
they look like cakes. They almost look like pita, round pita bread.
Oh, thank you.
There's no decoration on them. They're just stacked.
Yeah. Oh, I
mean,
guess
I
it's
could
just,
I can show a picture, but I don't think that'll.
oh, yeah, I see.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, interesting. And that's what they put out, fresh ones every day. No one
Right.
ate them, and then they threw them away. Panina, yeah.
Seems like kind of a waste.
Well, it was for God. Panina,
It's consecrated unleavened bread ritually placed by the Jewish priests of ancient Israel on the table, etc.
right. Nina,
You said you asked about the oil, and the story is that they did find a small container that was hidden somewhere. And,
yeah, here it is. Here
and
it is.
actually, I was kind of like teaching this subject in school when we invited actually a rabbi,
Right.
and he did this whole experiment that if the oil stands for a long time, it becomes purer and purer because it separates.
Uh-huh.
And then it will last longer than usual. So, and there was an experiment done in a classroom, and it was amazing to see the difference. So
Okay.
there was a possibility that this whole story of the small container actually worked. And because it stood that long hidden somewhere, that became so pure that it lasted longer. So
Well,
that's
yes, but it wasn't in the story of the Maccabees, but here, 600 years later, in the Talmud, here's what they wrote. So Susan Ehrlich, why don't you read this?
Sure. Oh, by the way, it was also right now that I also thought of Antioch, and I hadn't thought of it before. It was
Yeah.
like a couple of days like that.
Yeah, exactly.
When the Greeks entered the temple, they polluted all the oils in the temple. And when the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, overcame and defeated them, they checked and they found but one cruse of oil that was set in place with the seal of the high priest of the temple. But it was within only enough to light the menorah for a single day. A miracle occurred, and they lit from it for 8 days.
So that was written hundreds of years later. And there's no mention of it at the time, but it's exactly what Penina said. This is the story from the Talmud. So there's a question of why did the rabbis, okay, so now let's just end the share for a minute. Okay, so there's a couple of questions worth thinking about. First of all, why weren't the story of the Maccabees in the Tanakh? Why did the rabbis who put together the whole canon and collected what they wanted for the Torah, the prophets, and the writings include the Maccabees in there? And then why did they feel the need to add this story to the Talmud, which wasn't in the book of Maccabees? And I guess you could argue it happened and they didn't write it down, or it didn't happen and they needed to create it. Okay, but okay, wait, Cindy, yeah.
Okay, what I heard is that the rabbis didn't want a holiday celebrating war. And so they came up with this later, and it's a nice story for the children and led to a lot of nice things. And the reason, I guess it's not in the Torah, because the Torah ended with Moses
Tanakh.
dying.
No, the Tanakh. The whole
Tanakh. Was it canonized by this time?
No, yeah. Or they were putting it together, or it was canonized and it wasn't in there. So it was a conscious decision not to put it in there.
No, it's not because of it.
Okay, why do you think, Penina?
It was hidden. Nobody found it till the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1950 something.
I don't think so. That's not what I read. That's not
It
what
was
I
a
read.
book, but the book discovered to be just mostly strategies. But the story itself that brought to the strategies was hidden in those caves. It was no time at the time, they didn't get to it yet. Print was not that like today.
No, I know, but
it was hidden because of the Romans.
well,
And
that's
when the
I
Dead
never
Sea Scrolls were discovered, that's when they found it.
I never heard that, because
Yeah.
what I read is that, first of all, as Cindy said, they didn't want to encourage military, they didn't
Okay.
want to encourage military rebellion, because the Romans were, they had rebelled. They didn't want to encourage Jewish boys to rebel, whether that was the right or wrong decision. They thought they wouldn't survive. Number one. Number two, the Maccabees became corrupt. They were kings for a while, and they were corrupt kings. They were not good kings, as you know, that often happens when it's a dynasty. They were not descended from King David, so they weren't even considered legitimate kings. And there was this conflict between the rabbis and the priests, the Kohanim and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they felt that the upstart, Maccabees shouldn't be in the Tanakh. Plus, the story was too new. They just didn't feel it was worthy at the time. Now, I read a lot of different things, Penina. I never heard that they didn't know it.
It also was hidden during the Assyrian thing.
It could have been hidden, but the rabbis were aware of it. There was aware. No, because in the Septuagint, when the 70 rabbis were translating, they translated that. They had that. And it was not included, though, in the Tanakh. So there were a lot of reasons why it wasn't included in the Tanakh.
I thought that it was just not available in writing.
No, because it was translated into the Greek at that time.
Oh,
However,
okay.
a very nice, thoughtful woman, when we were talking about it on Friday night, suggested another reason. The temple had been destroyed. And so they needed to connect. They wanted to keep the Hanukkah story. They needed to connect it. They wanted to connect it to something symbolic of the temple. And so that was another reason to sort of include the story of the oil, of the light, of the beauty, of remembering the temple, as opposed to the people, But the light has come to mean so much to us as Jews, so important, not just as a symbol, not just of the Maccabees, because it is a symbol of the Maccabees, but also of a symbol of hope and a symbol of light. And I read another interesting little interpretation that the oil symbolizes the Jews, in that they always thought we would burn out. And we never burned out. And we still have our oil, our soul, our strength.
Shema.
Our neshama, even our soul, that the oil is symbolic of the constant miraculous existence of the Jewish people.
All this is very valid, but it
All of
doesn't
it.
actually interfere with the fact that the
Well, none of it
may
does.
I tell you something?
Yes, Donna.
When in light of what you're talking about, the miracles, one day I was cooking and some oil splattered on the floor.
Okay,
and it
that's not
splattered in
relevant.
the
Donna,
shape of
it's not
in the shape of
relevant.
a heart. It fell and it appeared in the shape of a heart. We're talking about the oil. and the
Donna,
water.
it's not relevant. Donna,
Well,
you
I
gotta
think
talk
in these
to this
days,
thing.
the oil and the war and peace,
Donna, it's
I
not
see something else.
relevant.
I don't agree, but I see something else.
Okay, I don't want to go.
I love you.
I love you too, but you cannot talk about personal things that have nothing to do with the topic. Okay,
Okay.
now I want to
All
go
right.
to
Okay.
Judith. I want to go to Judith because this is really interesting about Judith. Now, before I do, and I do have the summary, if anybody wants it, of her story, you can also look it up online, the story. But what do we know? What do you know, if you know anything about Judith? Does anybody know anything? Have you ever heard of her? Susan.
Yes, Judith was a Jewish woman, a widow, beautiful, in the town of Bethulia. And her town was being besieged by the Assyrians, the leader of whom was Holofernes. And everybody was scared in the town. And she had a plan. And she said, and which she executed, to make it short, she decided to go to the Syrian camp and go to the tent of Holofernes. She went with her maid, and she pleased him because she was so beautiful. And after, I think it was a few times, he invited her in her tent, and she gave him cheese and wine, and he fell asleep. And when he was asleep, she took his sword and beheaded him. And then,
Wow.
That sounds like Yael.
she put
Yes,
it
it does.
She put it in a sack, and she and her maid stealthily left camp. And she showed the townspeople the head of Holofernes, and I think they hung it out on stake. And the army was so distraught that they fled, and the town of Bethulia was saved. And her story has been recreated in over the centuries, in umpteen artworks. Very famous artworks, Judith and Holofernes. From the 17th century on, it became a symbol of powerful women. And it served it both, you're clapping, it's a story mainly in the Catholic Bible, but it also is in the Protestant. And during the Reformation times, Judith became a symbol of the Reformation, of courageous women. And this goes on to something else, and more than womanhood, and certainly in the late 20th and early 21st century, she's a major hero.
That's exactly right. I want to add a few details. The reason that she decided to go out and to try to save her people is they had a siege and they were starving the town. And they said, we'll give you like so many days and we're starving you, and then we're coming in and we're slaughtering you. And so they were ready to capitulate and give in, even though they knew it would be horrible. And she came down and she said, don't you believe, they very pious. She was a beautiful widow who basically hid her beauty. Usually she just was very plain, but she said, let's wait, give me a few days before you give in. So she dressed herself up in all her beautiful finery, and she went to the Syrian camp and said she was a traitor. She said, I can't stand it. I'm starving and whatever. I want to be on your side. So I will spy for you if you let me come in. And she was so beautiful. And they said, and I will tell you when it's time to attack. I will keep going back there and I will let you know when they're at their weakest. So they brought her in, and she was, she had her own tent and her maid, and she was very beautiful. And Holofernes, of course, was very taken with her. So she went back and forth between the two camps for 3 days. So they got used to seeing her walk around, leave and come, because she said, not yet, not yet. And then on the third day, she said to the king, to Holofernes, tomorrow you'll be able to attack. Let's celebrate. So he made this feast, and she, I don't know, she made cheese. I don't know, she had this cheese. They talk about it.
Let me get a
He
fondue.
brought this cheese and he ate it and said, have it. And it made him very thirsty. So then he drank a lot of wine and he fell asleep. And then she cut off his head, put it in a bag. But because she'd been walking back and forth for 3 days or whatever, when she walked out of the camp with this bag, nobody, suspected anything because, okay, she's going to spy. And then she came to the town and she showed the head and she said, now you can attack. And meanwhile, in the morning, they go down to wake up their general and he has no head.
Oh, God. Oh, God.
And
He
then
saved
the head
Israel. He saved the
hanging
Jewish
on the
people.
wall, the outer wall. And then they attacked, and they were, as Susan said, they were like, demoralized, and they couldn't fight. But also in the story of Judith, then everybody celebrates her, and she writes an epic poem. First, they praise her to the skies, and everybody's dancing and singing, and they love her. And then she writes an epic poem, and we know that this epic poem style happened with Deborah. She wrote a poem. Hannah wrote a poem. Miriam probably wrote the Song of the Sea. So there's this tradition of women being poets and beautiful or musicians and writing this beautiful, maybe that was a special, and dancing, that the women had a special role in military celebrations, and they were writers and poets. I think the women in ancient Israel had a lot more power, in their own land than we think about outside of the land when they were in, the diaspora. And then they say that she lived to be 105 and she was honored all her life. So that's sort of the story of Judith. But then the tradition. So what I want to look at is all the midrash and all the tradition of her and how she grew in stature, as Susan said, through the generations. So you can read it if we have time, but I think this is actually more interesting. So I wanted to share this with you. And I actually, here it is, the Judith. No, not text. Oh, hold on.
We're holding.
All right, hold on. Wait, where is the other one? Judith and Hanukkah. Okay, now let me go back to you all. And let me share. And here it is. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move you over here so you can see. Okay, so this is like an interesting paper, commentary, Jewish study about Judith. So and so who hasn't read? Stacy, you want to read? Are you up for it? Okay. But you're muted.
I want to ask you something quickly before we go into it. This is the Septuagint, but that's still the Tanakh, isn't it?
No, it's not in the Tanakh. The Septuagint was the translation, but the canonization of the Tanakh, they did not include it in there.
Oh, well, that I know. That's why I didn't.
This is part of what they call the Apocrypha.
Right, and I have a copy of the Apocrypha, but
Right, but you don't have it in your Tanakh. If you look at your Tanakh, it's not in there.
Okay, but the Septuagint then includes the Apocrypha? Is that what you're saying?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, because I know it's not in the Tanakh.
No, but this was, so it was in the Hebrew and then the Greek, but then the rabbis didn't include it. But
Right.
they refer to it in the Talmud. I don't know why they didn't include it. Maybe it was too late. Sometimes it's like, well, it's closed already. We've already canonized. So I'm not sure why.
Okay,
But
so
they refer to it a lot. Rashi even talks about her. So they knew about her, which is why I think this is an interesting article. Okay, Stacy.
We first hear of the heroine in the apocryphal book of Judith, a Jewish work which has survived in the
Septuagint
in Greek. In her
eponymous book,
Judith is a compelling and challenging figure, beautiful and bold, pious and violent, seductive and wise. She does not hesitate to take the initiative in saving her people when the leaders of her besieged city are ready to surrender, reprimanding the leaders for their lack of faith in God. She also toys with the enemy general
Holofernes,
using ironic and duplicitous words, as well as her extraordinary beauty to lull and then kill him.
Okay, one more.
We are shown the transformation of Judith from a reclusive and ascetic widow to a glamorous figure who marches into the enemy camp and seizes the opportunity to kill the drunken
Holofernes.
with his own sword when he means to seduce her in his tent. Judith offers her people military advice as well and celebrates the Israelites' victory in song, only to return to her quiet life at home. When Judith dies at the ripe old age of 105, she is mourned by all of Israel.
We love Judith. We love her. She's so great. Okay, Bonnie, do you want to read? Can you read, Bonnie?
Sure.
Can you see?
No, I can see it. I can see
Okay.
it. I can see. The book of Judith is filled with allusions to biblical figures, phrases, and episodes, and Judith herself incorporates many features of biblical women, reminding us, for instance, of Jael.
Yael.
Yael, sorry. Yael killing the vulnerable Sisera in a tent. Deborah exhorting and encouraging Barak, Miriam singing a victory song, and Esther saving her people from the threats of a foreign ruler.
Okay, so we see that she's in the tradition of a lot of great women, and we have to be very proud of these role models and celebrate them and teach them to our daughters and granddaughters and whatever, that there are these, they're military, they're brilliant, they're seductive. They do use their feminine wiles, but they use their brain and they use their brawn. And to remind you about Yael, for those who may not know who that is, during this battle, it's in the book of Judges, Sisera is like the head of the Canaanite army, and he flees after a rout and comes to her tent because he knows her husband. And even though she's not, we don't think she's an Israelite, but they're friends of the Israelites. Her husband is a Canaanite. So anyway, she gives him milk as opposed to Judith giving cheese. He says, "Can you give me something to drink?" And he says, "Give me water." And she says, "Well, why don't you have milk?" And milk, of course, makes you tired. It has tryptophan in it. And he falls asleep, and she takes a tent pin, a huge stake, and she drives it through his head and kills him. So it's similar, like Judith, one cuts off. I see Leslie's going, "Oh my God." One cuts off his head and one just pierces his head. But women, they know without the head, forget it. Okay.
And Deborah gives a homage, actually. And
yes, Deborah writes the beautiful epic poem, just like Judith and Miriam too. And they also, Deborah also, led the men into battle. The Barak, the Israelite general, said, "I'm not going unless you go with me." So she was like a symbol of God's presence and power and whatever. Okay, so do you want to read a little more?
Sure.
Me?
Oh, Bonnie.
Oh, okay.
Sure. Where Judah's story is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Judah's story disappeared from Jewish tradition fairly early in ancient times, and there is no trace of the tale in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in the works of Philo and Josephus. She is not mentioned in the Mishnah, Talmud, or other rabbinic literature, and it is only in the 10th or perhaps the 11th century, C.E. onwards, over 1,000 years after the
Apocryphal
book was first composed, that Judith is found once again in Jewish literature.
So that's interesting. Like, she disappears. It was written. There is a text, but it's not, they don't have it mentioned anywhere. And then
Where'd she go?
They just didn't talk about her. I don't know why. We don't know why. Okay, one more.
Do you want me to read one more?
One more, yeah. When Judith
does resurface in Jewish circles, it is in a variety of contexts and genres. Hebrew tales of the heroine, liturgical poems or
Piyutim,
Thank you. Commentaries on the Talmud and passages in Jewish legal code.
Which what? It tells you they knew about her. They were telling her story, but it wasn't written in any formal place, which is interesting. But it's not, I mean, they all knew about her and they referred to her over and over again. Okay, Leslie, you want to read? But you're muted. You're muted. Leslie, you're muted.
Sorry. In these medieval accounts, Judith is often associated with the holiday of Hanukkah, an association that likely goes back to the original writing of the book. I can never pronounce the name.
Good. I'm glad somebody else.
Book of Judith, generally dated to about 100 BCE, i.e. several decades after the reconsecration of the temple in 164 BCE by Judah the Maccabee, combines historical elements taken from many periods, including events and figures from Hasmonean times.
So they sort of mix it up. Her story is like what, 60 years later, and they change some of the names and they sort of combine different stories. So is this a made up story or did this happen? And if it was made up, why? It's not, I don't know. Okay. Go a little further, Leslie.
Thus, the fictitious enemy, and I can
okay, so just stop a minute.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Right there.
Okay, his name is Nebuchadnezzar, but that was the name of the king of Babylonia who destroyed the first temple. So they called king of Assyrians and not the Babylonians. Well, maybe they had the same name, but we know about the other Nebuchadnezzar. Go ahead. Who desires to be worshipped as a god.
Oh, I completely lost my place. Sorry. Who desires to be worshipped as a god seems closely related to the figure of Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanius, while his beheaded general, Holofernes, can't they just be called John?
Yeah.
I was just thinking that.
So much easier.
So much easier. Whose death leads to the rout of the enemy is reminiscent of the Seleucid general Nicanor, whose head is hung, and this is lovely, in the citadel of Jerusalem by Judah the Maccabee.
So we didn't read the whole book, but obviously he kills the Seleucid Greek general Nicanor and hangs his head. And so there's this similar idea. So we see similar, motifs. Go ahead. Judith herself. Leslie.
Judith herself can be seen as a variation on the figure of Judah Maccabee, as her very name hints. And in medieval Jewish texts, perhaps as a result of this association, Judith becomes an actual participant in events surrounding the Hasmonean victories. So that's your question of, is this story real? I'd say no.
Okay. You say no?
I say no.
I think it is.
I don't know. Well, then who wrote it? Oh, Pnina, yes.
It could be something.
The only, excuse
Go
me.
ahead, Leslie, and then Pnina. Leslie, what were you saying?
The way that they authenticated events and dates are from archaeological findings. So there was an archaeological finding that supposed to be around that same time that they found that a woman cut off her daughter's head and brought it to the gods. So the way of showing devotion to the gods were still done in a very barbaric way, as you see. And
Right.
as I said, if you want to authenticate a story, archaeology made it real.
So I don't know. I mean, I need to do more of my own research to see what the attitude toward Judith is, whether they say it's a story or it said it happened or something like it happened.
Well, it shows devotion and it shows commitment. And like I said, the archaeological findings show that people did show it that way. By a woman, they found a piece of something that showed that a woman cut off her daughter's head and gave it to the gods.
Right, but why would they
as a show of devotion?
I understand. That's interesting, but well, there's more. I mean, no, but why a woman? Why this? Let's just keep going a little more and see what we think.
Women a lot of the time were the priestesses themselves
That's true.
in the pagan culture.
Right, right.
Okay, so that's why.
Well, I think you bring up a point, which for me, and maybe perhaps not for all of you, is very confusing, which is they were Jewish, but they were pagan. They were, Maccabees.
It was mixed.
Something
It
else.
took time for all this
any
Judaism
individual
business to
person-
show up. It was mixed.
Right.
Okay, just a second. Okay, Leslie, think about today. There are Jews who have Christmas trees. There are Jews who celebrate some of the, okay, you have a Christmas tree? So
Well,
you,
I have palms in my house. and
okay,
I
well,
decorate my existing trees for the
but you're still
holiday.
Jewish, right? You're still
Yeah.
Jewish, right? Well,
Absolutely.
this is what we're
Freeman Buck-
talking about.
Catholic.
People incorporated the surrounding cultures
Sure.
into their lives, still feeling that they were Jewish. And culture in ancient times could have been, Penina's saying that some of them were pagan, and that could be the truth, but also they could be doing both. Listen, I
Yeah, to
believe
make sure it was all
They
covered.
did. That's
You know-
exactly what they did. They did both.
they
Yeah,
believe
because
in
they
God.
want to make sure they got it covered. Well, if my
Okay.
God's not the one, maybe Zeus
Let
is.
me
right?
explain one thing that I think it's important to think. The whole idea of developing the 10 Commandments was that they rejected the negative, and a negative of a negative makes a positive. That's how the 10 Commandments actually became. It things that you saw that were not the right thing to do. It wasn't in people's advantage to do this. So they negative the negative, and that's how the positive was born. That's it.
Okay, but that's not relevant to this. Well, I want, thank
It
you.
relatives to everything that they did that was not what we call Jewish today. That's it.
Right, but also you can imagine, particularly women, if they were pregnant, if they were struggling in childbirth, a lot of, I was just with some women, and one's a doctor, and she said that probably the greatest cause of death for most of history was childbirth. So I could see you saying, yes, I believe in Adonai, Eloheinu, but a little Isis goddess wouldn't hurt while I'm pregnant and while I'm giving birth, since she's the goddess of women and fertility. And so I think it makes sense that people, today people go to astrologers and they go to palm readers and they go to psychics, which is the Torah is considered paganism and idol worship. But it's like, listen, of course I'm Jewish, but what's wrong with astrology or, any of that stuff? So we have to stop looking.
I think that,
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Merle. Go ahead.
I think that people, there's two things here that I'm thinking. I think one, people will take other, let's call it cultures for anything else, for whatever works for them to make them
Exactly.
feel better about what's going on in their lives. I think people will adopt other cultures for their own ego or psyche,
And
whatever.
not only that, Buddhists who are Jews,
Yeah.
people are spiritual and they're seekers. They're just like us. They weren't these purists.
Rabbi Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego studied the stars of astrology.
That's right. It's even so. The thing is that we have to not look at them as this monolithic religious people. They weren't. They were exactly like us. Some were very religious. Some were, part of the culture. Some didn't even believe in it. I live in Judea. I'm a Judean. I don't have to do anything else. Just like in Israel. Look at Israel today. It's exactly like it probably was. Some were, some weren't. Some, they thought they were fanatics. The fanatics thought they were heretics.
And Israel has monasteries in Jerusalem.
Oh,
There is the monastery of the quiet, the ones who doesn't
Ready to go?
And
Right.
people, and they're not being chased out of there.
No,
They
of
live
course.
there,
But
so there we go.
we're really talking about the different levels of Jewish practice. Was just like this, Pamela. Yes. You're muted.
Okay, so I have a few thoughts.
Good.
I think it's interesting that it's probably the case then, as it is sort of kind of the case still today, that males run sort of the outward society of life and females sort of take care of the inward, the social relationships, the home, all that stuff, right? So when it comes to childbirth and something so female, like you can't really get any more female than childbirth.
Right.
And so it seems to me that the gods of the men, of the way the world works, yes, everybody does those observances, but then the women have their ways and they have their this and their that. And if the nature gods are thought to be more feminine and the divine feminine, then those are going to still permeate in a woman's world more than they're going to make it into the mainstream. Let's put it in the Torah in the man's world, right? So I think there's that. And I also think, so I read a long time ago, then I just looked it up just now, about Shamash, Shamash. And I put it in the chat. There's he was the god of, I don't know if it was in Assyria or whatever I said that I just found it in. And he was an ancient god of Mesopotamia, and he was the god of light. And the light that we use to light the menorah candles is, guess what? The sun.
Right, but the word that it's really closer to is shemesh, which means sun. In
Okay,
Hebrew.
it's the
Close.
same, but
Yeah.
it's the same. And so it was a god in Mesopotamia, the sun god. And then we incorporate it, just like in the Christian world, you have a Christmas tree. Christmas tree is thought to be a pagan ritual because it was the evergreen and all that. So we're just incorporating this bits and piece and this bit and piece as we all come to coalesce into something that resembles some sort of unified thing, but it's always in motion.
It's always in motion. And Penina will tell you that most of the names of the Hebrew months are the names of pagan gods. They're all different names of pagan gods. I don't
Rosh Hashanah falls on Tishrei, which is a Babylonian god, Tishritum. Yes.
Yeah, there's like all of them, Cheshvan, and they're all different gods. So you're absolutely right. It's an incorporation. So this story of Judith, though, what time is it? Oh, we have 10 minutes. Let's just read a little more because it's such a great story for women. It's such a great story. And I just wonder who wrote it. Okay. Purim was Esther, Hanukkah with Judith. So Rebecca, you want to read?
Purim with Esther, Hanukkah with Judith. Another reason for the introduction of Judith into Hanukkah tales and customs seems to be the many parallels between Judith and Esther, two beautiful and seductive Jewish heroines who saved their people. The two holidays instituted by the rabbis, Hanukkah and Purim, are often linked together. And since Purim has a heroine, Esther, and a scroll telling her story, the Megillah Esther, this may have led to the analogous holiday Hanukkah, which has no special text of its own, being assigned to a similarly brave and beguiling heroine. Indeed, at the times, Judith's story is entitled Megillah Yehudit, the Scroll of Judith. Thus, even though there is nothing explicit in the text linking Judith with Hanukkah, Judith's tale is frequently enmeshed with the story of Hanukkah from medieval times onward.
Okay, I want to go to this thing here. They also talk, okay, so there's something that I sort of knew, but I didn't realize. They also connect Judith to Delilah, but there was a custom that the Greeks imposed. This is one of the horrors that they imposed when they were taking over, is this thing called in ius primae noctis, which means that the leader, the Greek leader, has the right to sleep with any bride, any virgin bride before her wedding night. He gets to deflower her before she married. And there's this legend here. Look at this. One group of Hebrew Jewish stories is directly linked to Hanukkah, and these stories fall into two parts. In the first part, we hear of the assassination of the enemy leader by the Hasmoneans, who object to the leader's desire to exercise his right to sleep with the bride on the first night when their sister is about to be married. This is like Judah Maccabee's sister. Judith, who is now identified as a relative of the Hasmoneans, then beheads a different enemy commander in the second part of these stories. Often another woman, a member of the Hasmonean family who is generally identified as the sister of Judah Maccabee, plays a critical role in the events preceding Judith's own activities in the Hasmonean heroine. Hannah, as she is sometimes called, shares Judith's wisdom and courage. Both women are found in a liturgical poem. And they also, so there's like suddenly all these references. Okay, and here, this is interesting. Although Judith is never mentioned in the Talmud itself, later commentators on the Talmud refer to her, always in the context of Hanukkah. These commentators do not tell Judith's story for its own sake, but use elements of her tale to explain the commandments and customs of the holiday. Rashi, when discussing why women as well as men are required to light Hanukkah candles, notes, they were part of the same miracle when the Greeks decreed that Jewish virgin brides were to be bedded first by the ruler. A woman brought about the miraculous rescue. So they say that that's Rashi, that's Judith. And then Rashi's grandson, the Rashbam, says that the chief miracle of Purim came through Esther and that of Hanukkah to Judith. Okay, so there's all these, they knew about her. There's no text, but they knew about her. And here is this custom to eat cheese. So let's see. Merle, why don't you read the custom to eat cheese?
Later commentaries bring further details. Stop moving. Nisim ben Reuben, known as the Ron,
Right.
refers to Judith not by name, but as the daughter of Johann. In his account, which he says comes from a midrash, the woman gave the chief enemy cheese to eat as to make him thirsty and then drunk, and then cut off his head. Thus adds the Ron, is why it's customary to eat cheese on Hanukkah.
Well, I guess in medieval times, it was the custom to eat cheese. We don't have that custom at all. So that's really interesting. Okay.
The fact that it's milk, it has to do also with the fact that the woman is the mother and the source of life, and that's how she nurtures their babies they get milk from the mother.
I like
the
that.
association of the milk and the woman it's a very natural association here.
Right.
Yeah,
but
we
this-
keep
that makes
Godfrey, the
sense.
same thing with Godfrey.
but
the
cheese.
custom,
And then it
yeah.
says in a work outlining Jewish laws and customs called the Kolbo from the 13th or 14th century, you find a similar version. In this account, the king of Greece attempts to seduce Judith, the daughter of the high priest Yochanan, and she feeds him a cheese dish so that he will become thirsty, drink too much, and fall asleep. Okay.
Didn't have milk, so he gave him.
All right, Meryl, just read this one here.
Such references to Judith's encounter with an enemy whom she fed eat either cheese or milk, compare
Yeah.
Yeah.
are subsequently found in a long line of works which codify halakha and halakha and supply the background to the practice of eating cheese dishes on Hanukkah. Similar remarks are found in Jewish guides and responsa written to this very day.
So, okay, so then as Susan Ehrlich said, that there's, she's appeared in art. And here, I wanted to close with this. Look at this. This is a Hanukkah menorah from 1746. And if you can see, here's Judith, and she's holding his head. Can you imagine that? And his sword, you see? And
So
can you
cheese
imagine-
doesn't have a very good connotation. She feeds it to people and then cuts
Right.
off their heads.
Yes, but we're celebrating her cleverness. So look at how beautiful this menorah is, and it's got Judith on it. So
Wow,
we
that's so
see
pretty.
that even though it's not in any of our texts and it disappeared for 1,000 years, the story was well known and told over and over again. And I think she combines the perfect Israelite woman, if you think about it. She's wise, she's beautiful, she's religious, she never, takes another husband after her husband dies. She's a widow. So the men love that, she's faithful to the memory of the husband. But then she goes and she's a warrior and she advises militarily. I mean, this is the perfect Jewish woman.
Oh my God.
When I looked, I might have misread it, but it seemed like from one of the pages, the story of Judith was 65 years after the story of the Maccabees.
Right. That's right.
So I don't understand how her and the
Listen,
cheese gets to be Hanukkah.
You have painters who are totally impressionism, and they made pictures of a lot of sceneries from the Bible, and they weren't even Jewish.
No, we know
Like
that.
the death of the sacrificial, even Jesus with the last
But
meal.
that's not what Cindy's saying. Cindy's saying that how did this story start?
Because people tell it to each other, and it remains to the point that even today, or like
No,
not
that's
today,
not
maybe
my
100
point.
years
My
ago,
point was
painters did
the
pictures
events
of
were
it.
65 years apart.
Cindy, what you say?
Okay, and what your point is what? The Torah wasn't written till several hundred years after it happened, or
But the
something
stories
happened.
were, the
It's the-
stories by mouth from one person to another were.
Who knows? Who knows? But I love that even if the story kept growing and growing and growing, it's another example, I think, of the power of women and the ideal of women and the image of women in the ancient world. And that when we sometimes look at what's considered, Orthodox or the standard Judaism of today, where the women are kind of kept in their own little category, that's not our tradition. Our tradition is for women to be wholly engaged in society while following halacha and all that, and stepping up and doing what needs to be done when the time comes. So may we all take the image and the example of Judith as we go forward into the new year, to 2020.
Bless you, Doris.
Let us be women warriors for our people.
I'm taking cheese off of our menu for dinner.
Why did they
Much
say
cholesterol.
Cheese and Hanukkah
Okay,
in
cheese.
solidarity with Judith? I mean, I've never heard that. Of course,
I haven't either. I haven't.
Neither of the rest of us, Leslie.
Oh, I'm not alone. Okay, good.
I don't know. It's interesting.
Happy New Year, everybody. Happy
Happy New
Hanukkah.
Year.
We'll see you
Yes,
all.
happy Hanukkah.
Happy New Year,
Happy Hanukkah.
Santa Monica.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody. Love you. Bye.
To become bloodthirsty. God. Go.